Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, it's those things that go bump in the night which really transfix us to the big screen, and it's, if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you're in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Weiner, and I'm the host of this podcast where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion. And if you like how we do things over here, and you're listening right now, so I'm assuming that you do, you can find us, our podcast, basically wherever you find your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, it's all good. And plus, you can find every single one of our episodes archived over at our YouTube channel. Plus, it'd be great if you'd follow us on social media. You can do that at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, at either In the Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, please give us a visit over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, for all the latest and greatest movie news and reviews from the world of television, film, entertainment in general, and basically anything else that we can think of. We love talking about the moving image, and we love it when you pay us a visit, so please come on by. On this one, this is going to be a good episode. We have got director David Weiner with his new documentary, In the Search of Darkness 2, which is an epic. Basically, it's a super doc, and it's part 2 of a super doc. It is the second part of a deep dive into the history of horror films from the 1980s. The first film was 2.5 hours. This film is well over 4 hours. Excuse me. This film is well over 4 hours, and it is so much fun. If you're a hardcore fan, if you're a casual fan, if you're somebody who wants to know more, both In Search of Darkness and Search of Darkness 2 have been really these fantastic sort of ultra deep dives into a genre that, while it gets appreciated, I don't think anything's ever quite as been appreciated like this has. And we talked with David just about sort of the inspiration for the films, and sort of his process of vetting and going through everything, because, while you might think that this second film is just stuff that they left on the cutting room floor, it really isn't. It is a very well-crafted and sort of additional piece to sort of the education for anybody who needs and wants to know a little bit about 1980s horror films. I do highly recommend this, because it goes from the stuff that you expect to the stuff that you don't expect. And this guy is a machine of a filmmaker, and he is working on so much different stuff. And when we talked to him, we talked a little bit just about sort of his process and how he goes through it, and we talked a little bit about curation. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but that's okay, because it's so vital to be able to go through and sort of remember some of these films that, well, you may or may not be a fan of. They have their place, and it's an important thing to remember them. And places like Shudder, who is streaming this documentary now, and other streaming services that may have them, like boutique ones like Shudder. But also, if you really want to pick up a copy and have ones for yourself, it's important to support labels like Shout Factory, Scream Factory, Vinegar Syndrome, Severin Films, Synapse Films, because they keep some of these really obscure and important films alive. And, I'm gushing, but I love not just these 2 films about 80s horror, but I am so excited to look forward to his 80s science fiction doc called In Search of Tomorrow, which is basically taking the same approach. And if you want to support it, I do recommend that you go visit www.80sscifidoc.com, which will have details about his Indiegogo campaign and a few other things going on. And you got to support this guy, because this is curation. This is cinema history sort of laid out in a very nice, neat package. And for any kind of film fans out there, I think this is absolutely vital viewing because, like I said, these movies are 4.5 hours long, but they absolutely fly, and I cannot recommend them enough. So, if you have Shudder, I do recommend going and checking it out now. And if you don't, I would sign up for Shudder because it's a fantastic streaming service with a lot of important and really interesting stuff that to come out of the horror genre from not just present day, but from back to the 60s, 70s, and even like 30s and 40s with some pretty fun, weird stuff. So do go check it out and enjoy our talk with David. It is a damn good one. No sweat, man. I mean, obviously, congratulations on the films. I guess my first question is, and this is probably the one you get all the time, what inspired, I guess, such a deep dive? Because I mean, really, I think you've rewritten the definition of what a deep dive means on these films.
Well, I had always wanted to make movies ever since I was a kid, and I went a different route. I did production, I did development, I wrote scripts, I worked on other people's scripts. I worked as a waiter. I worked in entertainment journalism, and always in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, I still want to make movies at some point. So I think I overcompensated with my opportunity, and I figured with my first movie, I'll make two, and with my second movie, I'll make two more. So even though I've made two movies, I feel like I've made 4 or 5, given that they're 4.5 hours each. But that being said, In Search of Darkness, In Search of Tomorrow, In Search of Darkness Part Two, they're deep dives into a decade, and when you're tackling so much material, there's just no way you could do it in a brief way without leaving so much out. And I'm a bit of a completist, and even though I know I can't get it all, given the opportunity to keep going, this In Search of Darkness was always supposed to be 90 minutes, 2 hours, 2 hours and a half at the most. But the structure, 1980 to 1989, a couple movies in between, a chapter in between those to
Right.
get larger context concepts to be discussed. It just demands more time. And I'm very fortunate that Robin Block, the executive producer of these movies, who gave me the opportunity in the first place to write and direct them, gave me carte blanche to just do as much as I wanted. And I wanted to do a lot.
Well, it's a beautiful thing because I mean, honestly, man, they're entertaining, but they're informative at the same time. Because I mean, obviously, I'm a movie guy. I've watched a lot, but the more it goes down, because I mean, you'll get the obvious ones as you're going through the decade, but then more and more, it's like, oh yeah, that one. Oh yeah, that one. And I mean, and when you're getting clips and when you're getting people to talk about it, like walk me through, I guess, sort of the research process, because I mean, especially on some of these films, they've been licensed out so many different times to so many different places. You've got to figure out who rights holders are and the whole 9 yards. I've got to imagine it's a research and logistical nightmare just to be able to get everything together, especially on some of the more obscure films that are showcased in both films.
It's a complicated process. It really fundamentally comes down to what came out and what is something I want to cover. Then I sort of go through who's available to talk about it or who knows enough about it if they weren't part of that project, and who's available. And it's sort of a chicken and the egg element, because I map out and I outline the entire movie beginning to end. But there's always a sort of give or take with some movies that I want to put in, but I just don't have enough material in terms of the interviews, or material that I'm not satisfied with. Conversely, sometimes during our conversations, because I sit down with everyone for anywhere between an hour to 2 hours, sometimes even 3 if they're willing, and other movies will come up. Hey, have you talked about this? And I'm like, no, let's talk about it. And then that gets added to the roster. Yeah, but then you got to find these films and get clips for them. And, it's all credit to my editor, Sam Way, who makes a 4.5 hour movie like this fly like it's nothing.
True.
And we work on this very intimately together, in terms of what works and what doesn't, and how to provide a movie in its best light and context, and not spoil too much, but keep the goodies in there saying, "Oh, that's good. Oh, that's my favorite scene. Are they going to show this? No. Oh, they didn't spoil it." So sleepaway camp, you can only show so much,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
you want to entice people that it's more than what it seems to be, but then you don't want to like reveal that big ending. So I'm actually pretty proud at the way we kind of reveal nothing but something at the end of that one.
And I mean, that kind of dovetails into something else, because especially in watching the second one just now, or even, I noticed that there seemed to be a lot more focus on some of the Italian ones. Is that just a timing issue, or just a question of availability? Why did a lot more of the sort of giallo and sort of Italian horror films come up in this sort of in this second part, as it were?
That's a great question. I would say, frankly, it's a bit of compensation. I when I did the first In Search of Darkness, I wanted there's hundreds of movies that came out,
Right.
and I made a very difficult decision that wasn't necessarily popular and for me personally too. But I was like, I'm just going to focus on North American movies. The heavy hitters. I'm just going to sort of do that and throw in some more eclectic movies and titles in there. But it's really going to be the big movies and the sequels and the franchises and select movies that people may never have heard of. And, you just couldn't fit it all. And I just hoped that one day I would get another opportunity to keep on going, because we didn't know we were going to get to make In Search of Darkness Part 2. That wasn't the plan always.
Right.
In the back of my mind, I knew that with the wealth of material that I got, when you sit down with like, upwards of 50 people and you have 100 hours of footage, you want to be able to get to the rest of that stuff. So it's not like what's left on the cutting room floor that wasn't good enough for the first 4 hours is in the second movie. It's like there's so much more, and now we get to expand to international releases: Italian, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Japanese stuff, to get to talk to Shinya Tsukamoto about Tetsuo.
Oh God, yeah.
Just an absolute dream. And we used an interpreter, and we had this amazing conversation. I did it from my desk, through modern technology with a local crew, filming it in Tokyo. So the answer is it was an intentional postponement, but I think it really enriches part 2, because for all the things, if you were satisfied with part 1, well, great. If you were disappointed that the movie that you wanted didn't make it in part 1, now ideally it's in part 2, but there's still room for more. I didn't get to it all. And lastly, I'll say that the conceit of all those posters, before you go into each movie, you sort of zoom around all the movie posters that came out that year.
Yeah.
I very much intentionally put posters of movies that I wasn't going to cover, to at least indicate to the audience that there's so much more out there to discover. And I know that they're there, but we just can't get to them all.
Well, and this is, I mean, it really is such a beautiful acknowledgement to not just the genre and the decade, but also, something that we see nowadays with people going, oh, well, I've watched everything on such and such a service. It's like, no, you haven't. There is so much more.
It's not all there. It's not all out there. Some of it is only physical media.
Yeah.
If you get to the end of In Search of Darkness Part 1, Phil Noble Jr., who's the editor-in-chief of Fangoria, he makes a very interesting, he just presents that it's very interesting that there's a digital divide. And so every time something starts going from theatrical to VHS and Laserdisc, if it didn't make the jump to DVD, if it didn't make the jump to Blu-ray, if it's not making the jump to 4K, titles left and right are just disappearing. And you can't expect streaming services to stream them, and they're not making physical release copies, and they're starting to disappear unless you have someone like Shout Factory or Vinegar Syndrome or some of these other rescue operations. It's almost like adopt a pet,
It's true, it really is.
So and Shudder, of course, a shout out to Shudder, not only because they're screening, they're showing In Search of Darkness and In Search of Darkness Part 2 this month, but they roll in and roll out, so it's really like appointment viewing. lot of great classic stuff. I mean, there's a bunch of Val Lewton movies, that no one would ever expect on Netflix to show up.
Yeah.
Maybe Criterion Collection, but that's about it. So there's a rich history that goes way back, that the '80s, sits on a very strong foundation of, and anyone who's interested in horror needs to do some digging and enlighten themselves.
Now, something else I love about the films is just that, I mean, well, obviously you're going to have people like Phil and sort of your expected talking heads to go over all the films. There are other people as well. Like, I mean, I was watching the new one and it's like, oh, Chris Jericho. Oh, that's a fresh face. Walk me through sort of not just pitching people to sit down and do interviews, but getting people that maybe the horror audiences wouldn't necessarily expect.
Darcy the Mail Girl, Diana Prince, from Joe Bob Briggs and Last Drive-In. The first time around, she said, "You got to get Chris," and she put him on my radar. I'm not I enjoy wrestling, but I'm not a wrestling. I don't follow it actively. I did back when Andre the Giant and
Right.
Hulk Hogan were doing their things, but she said he's a horror aficionado. He loves this stuff. He's really into it. You got to track him down. And fortunately, we were able to do that for part 2. And a lot of this, the credit goes very much to Robin Block, who, for the most part, I choose who is going in there. But Robin is constantly saying, let's think of it outside the box. Who taps into an audience that isn't just a hardcore audience of horror, but there's that crossover. So that'll bring in someone like Corey Taylor of Slipknot, or Chris Jericho, who is a singer, a wrestler, has his podcast. He's sort of a multi-hyphenate. And the initial conceit for this was always, yes, there will be people who worked on these movies, and there will be, journalists and experts who know about this stuff. But I wanted to include at least a handful of people who are connected to, who came later, but were actively influenced by this genre, or are currently influencing the genre, but drawing on it. Someone like Katie Featherston, for example. So that's kind of the mindset. But it's really about, who do I want? I want everybody who's available with our limited time and budget and, production time frame, all that kind of stuff. And I want to also get a good balance of people. I want to get on-camera people. I want to get effects people. I want to get composers. I want to get some of the more obscure folks that, had a real solid hand in steering this entire decade of amazing filmmaking.
No, for sure. And I mean, just as the films unroll and you sort of peel back all the layers of each onion, and then there's genres, and then there's subgenres, and then there's subgenres of subgenres, and how important was it for you to sort of make sure that you were painting as broad a stroke as possible? Because I mean, I'm not a fan of, like, say, Cannibal Ferox or Cannibal Holocaust, but I mean, I do at least acknowledge that they exist, and there is an importance to the fact that they do exist.
Yeah, well, between those found footage films and when when animals attack,
right?
There's the subgenres are endless. I mean, there was like movies like Slugs that I wanted to put in there, but I snuck some footage in there to just sort of illustrate the point. There's just so much of it there. Horror is this ultimate, this is maybe a cliche thing to say, but it's like the ultimate buffet, and there's something for everybody, especially when you're looking at subgenres. And you might not like everything, but you can see collectively how it all makes sense and is all building on this ultimate eccentric genre that so many people like for so many different reasons. And we all have our favorites, and we all have ones that might not be our cup of tea. And I'm very much like that too. You say Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox. That's not something I say, oh, it's Friday, break out a brew and pop in Cannibal Holocaust for my entertainment right after I've eaten and watching animals be killed. But it has its place in horror history, and I think it very much deserves to be discussed. And that's where I wanted to go with In Search of Darkness Part 2 very much as well, is, some of these off the beaten path films that do not age well in terms of the recontextualization when you look back at these things. But that doesn't mean you cancel them. You discuss them and you say they fit back then because, or they were doing these to make a buck because, or they were exploitative because, and they fit. Doesn't mean that they're correct or politically correct now, but they were made, they exist, and if you can learn from them in terms of how to progress with storytelling and genre storytelling specifically, then they all are they have their merit.
Well, and it speaks to also just on one level how respected the horror genre really is, at least from the inside the industry, because there are, as part two shows, there are so many award-winning actors who have done horror. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I forgot Robert Forster even did a giant alligator movie. You know
Right,
what I
right.
mean?
Well, yeah, you look at like Bill Pullman in Serpent and the Rainbow,
Yeah.
which I haven't gotten to cover yet. That's coming up soon. But there's everyone has dipped their toe. You look at Creepshow. Creepshow is just like a greatest hits. You've got Ed Harris doing the ultimate funky dance. In one of the anthology segments of the original Creepshow. It's a who's who. If you go through, there's some really well-known people, and of course a lot of people got their starts, whether it's filmmakers, whether it's David Cronenberg or Jamie Lee Curtis. This was a blank canvas for them to sort of figure out their careers and take on opportunities because they wanted to get started. And once they got it, made a name for themselves, they evolved. But never forget.
Well, and it also shows, at least for some of these filmmakers, just the ability to laugh at it in hindsight. I mean, I think I was struck by Dante's line about the ripoffs of Gremlins. And it's just like, well, I can't rag on him too much because my first film was a ripoff too.
Exactly. He's a very self-aware and self-effacing. He's not as self-effacing as John Carpenter, but he's a humble and incredibly talented and knowledgeable individual. But that totally cracked me up. He's not going to tinkle a bell every time a knockoff from Gremlins shows up.
How important
and declare unclean. That's what he said.
Of course, yeah. How important was it for you to have extended time with people like Tom Savini and people like Nancy Allen, just to really show sort of their extended influence over the entire decade?
It's priceless. These movies are a time capsule. They really are. I mean, we're not the first movie to come along and sit down with these folks, but they're not getting any younger. And their recollection is, it's different when you're not sitting with someone at a junket or at a convention.
Right.
When they come to you specifically to sit down with you for a good hour, and then we get caught up in things and we can go even more. We're incredibly fortunate to have that, and that yields incredible fruit. I mean, we go down all these tangents and rabbit holes, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I haven't thought of that in years." Or, I don't think I've ever told the story. If you have the time to talk with these folks and talk about not only their greatest hits, but some of their greatest misses, or the ones they're more fond of, but they don't get an opportunity to talk about as much. You get amazing conversations. And in Search of Darkness Part 2 compared to Part 1, Nancy Allen is like a perfect example, or Tom Savini. I was not able to get them in the first film, but I got them in the second film. But I came up with sort of a creative conundrum in terms of telling their story, because we already covered Creepshow. We already covered Dress to Kill. Carrie came out in the 70s. We're focusing on the 80s here. So to do these sort of mini career retrospectives with, Nancy Allen on Nancy Allen, Tom Savini on Tom Savini, Linnea Quigley on Linnea Quigley, Robert Englund on Robert Englund, and sort of give them an opportunity to talk about their career, where they fit, why they whether they love horror or not, are just not interested, but the genre opportunities came their way. Do they feel like they got typecast? What did they learn from this? What can they offer in terms of lessons learned? It's just it's priceless opportunity to be able to put something together.
Well, and I mean, it really is also a reminder of the kind of love and the kind of passion there is inside the horror community as well. And just seeing these people talk very honestly and very sort of openly about, like you say, their career high and lows. I mean, I had forgotten there was a Ghoulies 3, and one of your main clips of Kane Hodder is him with his ass in a water bucket. And I mean, and that's just a
Right.
great clip.
Also, it's important, you know, in that acting segment, these actors are known for horror mostly,
Yeah.
and they either have done other things or they're interested in doing other things. Or I love it that Laurie Cardill's like, you know, I want her to be, you know, in art. What did she say? Architecture.
I think
I
so.
should know now. Yeah, I'm confusing it with yeah. She wanted to be in architecture, but Kane Hodder wanted to be a cartographer. He was into map making. You know, nobody knows that, or few people do. And how cool is that you can include an element like that where they're like, well, I wanted to do this, but then I became Jason for 4 movies, but there's more to me. You know, I'm a stuntman, but I'm an actor, and I'm interested in things other than horror. And you don't get these opportunities once you get pigeonholed for something. And yeah, it's pretty cool stuff.
Having spent or having created almost 9 hours of sort of retrospective and homage to this decade in this genre, I'm kind of curious, is there anything that you discovered along the way that kind of surprised you?
I've discovered making these movies collectively has really allowed me to understand why people love movies that aren't very good, myself included. But it allowed me to really sort of put a lens over it and understand why. And realizing that it's not always just about the movie itself. It's about the time you saw the movie, where you were, who you were, how old were you, what it represented for you. Was it an escape? Was it a guilty pleasure? Did you sneak it, you know, in the middle of the night on cable when your parents were asleep? You know, did your friends have a bootleg tape of Faces of Death that you were not allowed to watch? You know, were your parents fighting and you needed to get out of the house, so you went to the movie theater to escape, and some movie was just the perfect tonic for you when that happened? We circle ourselves around these movies because they mean so much to us. And so there's something very unique about horror versus other genres also, that we recognize its faults and we recognize its imperfections and we embrace them versus judge them. And if I've learned anything, is that I could easily put Chopping Mall next to The Shining side by side and not say, well, this is clearly better than that. We all disdain that. This is clearly better, and we all know it. It's like, no, they're apples and oranges. This is why we love this. Maybe here's something you didn't know about it. This is why we love this. Maybe you didn't know this about it. That is something that I've really embraced in making these projects, that really justifies how I go about it with with resolve, really.
Well, and it reminds us that it's really all about context as well. Because I mean, I love that you brought up Chopping Mall, because I don't think I would have understood that movie if I had watched it when it came out. But now I love it. It's fantastic. It's one of those things that so many of these movies, especially inside the horror genre, almost need that separation from the initial run, and they need to, they needed to be able to be seen on a shelf and go, what the hell is this? All right, I'll rent it. That kind of.
I didn't rent it. I dodged it because of I've said this before, but it's very important because, like many others, I would work my way through the video store and I'd see that Shopping Mall box, and I'm just like, I see a bony hand with a bag with body parts. Like, nah, it's not for me. I see that right next to Cannibal Holocaust. I'm going to keep walking.
Right.
And,
yeah.
I mean, we all have our predilections when it comes to what we want to rent. But that was something where it misrepresented what that film was about.
Yeah.
About Terminator Johnny Five robots in a shopping mall killing teens. That I had no idea that was about robots killing people. Until much later, and I love it now, and it's super fun, and I love the people who are in there. It's got such a wonderful cast. But anyway, I only discovered that one later.
Now I'm curious, what do you think it is about horror and obviously sci-fi coming up later this year that allow, especially from the decade of the 80s, that allow these kind of deep dives. Because if, like, a year from now, we find out you're doing a 80s rom-com deep dive, I'm not sure it would work quite the same.
We like to say, is there a convention circuit out there for it? If there
Right.
is, that means there's an audience for it.
No, that's
You don't
true.
see you don't see a lot of comedy conventions. People go get comedy all the time, stand up, and it's wonderful. I do the same, but I've never looked for, found, or had the desire to go to a comedy convention, a romantic comedy, a drama convention.
Right. Yeah.
There's something about genre films, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, action, superheroes that seems to really corner the market in terms of the enthusiasm for this kind of stuff. And so that's also where I think there's a much stronger pull of nostalgia for these films than others necessarily. I mean, that doesn't mean like one of my all-time films is Breaking Away, Bad News Bears. Those are sports movies.
Yeah.
I'm not like a huge sports guy, and I love those movies because they're about underdogs and the human spirit and imperfect drama and friendship. Absolute great films, and I'm just thinking about them now, and I could talk about those for like another hour. but those, there's nostalgia for all sorts of movies that were important in our lives at the right time. I mean, I remember seeing Rocky 2 and Rocky 3 in the theater, and my feet weren't touching the ground. I was so exhilarated by the excitement of the movie. Movies really transport us in a way that so many things don't. And our nostalgia for all those things are strong. And so, if anything, the movies that I make, they remind you of the movies that you love. They reinforce the knowledge that you know. Ideally, you learn a couple things that you hadn't learned before. You learn of movies that you didn't know existed, or you knew of them but you didn't know they were about, like, robots killing people instead of body parts. And then having seen the people who made these not only talk about their own movies, but talk about movies that they love as fans. It's just this collective conversation that's an absolute love letter to the genre.
No, and it's one of those things, at least from my perspective, it feels important to put out there, because it's easy to lose perspective on how much great stuff was out there and is out there that still needs an audience and is still looking for audiences. And I'm kind of curious, as you've been immersed in this nostalgic deep dive world for so long, I'm kind of curious, as a filmmaker, do you see yourself doing anything sort of outside that world, or are you focused on sort of films about the love of film, I guess? Maybe
I've always, I went to film school. I've made short films. I've worked on many films myself on the set. I always wanted to be a filmmaker, but filmmaking, it's an incredible time suck. So there's sacrifices that need to be made. And I'm a family man. I have a family. I have a wife and a kid, and a home, and that kind of life that I'm very fortunate to have. And being able to make these movies, I can do them within the framework of my life and maintain a quality existence with my family and not disappear. As soon as I'm on a set for 18 to 20 hours a day, 5-6 days a week, months at a time, on location, all that kind of stuff, that's something I wanted to do early on in my career, and the stars didn't align. If the opportunity came along and I could do it when my kid's a little older, I would absolutely embrace it. But these are the kind of things I think about. I kind of rationalize it. So I'm very, very happy to be able to make these movies, especially during the pandemic era,
for sure,
where I can literally do half of it. I mean, I'm shooting. I had Flash Gordon in my backyard this week. Literally, Sam J. Jones. Doesn't get better than that. One. Bruce Boxleitner, Alex Winter, Walter Koenig, Adrian Barbeau is coming on tomorrow. It's that's fun. That's fun. But I'm literally doing it in my backyard, because normally we shoot in a studio in Burbank. But because of COVID, you can't be in a contained space. I want to be outdoors where we can have the social distance, but also the airflow. And so no one's at risk. including the talent and myself and my family. So I'm very happy to be able to do that and then get on my computer and, edit movies with my editor who lives in the UK. Like, how cool is that too? So anyway, that's a very long answer, but that's kind of like how I see things right now. The sacrifice for making movies is not in the cards for me right now when it comes to live action features versus
Right.
documentaries.
Well, and I mean, just the image of everyone doing post in Zoom is always one that kind of makes me furrow my brow, but laugh at the same time because I got to imagine it's a unique experience.
It works like a charm. It works really well. The 8 hour difference between myself and the UK,
Right.
it means that I can script things. I script all this stuff. I cherry pick, I take an interview, I take the transcription, I cherry pick the bites, I script it and put it all together. I hand it, as a segment or a chapter to my editor, Sam, and he'll string it together while I'm sleeping.
Yeah.
I wake up in the morning. He's like, here's how it looks. What do we add? What do we subtract? Looks good. Let's add a couple things. Let's subtract a couple things. Now let's start painting it. Let's start putting, all the BTS, all the behind the scenes footage, or stills, the clips that make sense. And then there's just the back and forth that way. All right, let's fine tune this, less of this, more of this. Let's find another angle. Let's, here's a piece I still need, and I'm still getting interviews. I need someone to say this to give it a better context or to frame it better or just to explain something better. Or here's a great factoid that we really just didn't get anyone to say. So let's have someone talk about that. That's the process. And it does take some time and it's very intense. But while it is labor intensive, it flows pretty well and it's pretty easy. And when I say that in italics, it's easy, but it's a lot of work. But I'm very fortunate that we can do it this way.
Now, I mean, just to put a bow on this, I mean, in watching your films, I really get the sense that they're almost a love letter to the need for curation, especially in the cinematic world. Because, I mean, given what's happened with theaters and given sort of the landscape now with content sort of being almost barfed at us on a weekly basis, I'm kind of curious on your perspective of that. Because, like you say, like there are so many films that don't necessarily fit the algorithm, that don't necessarily fit sort of the quote unquote, ways of programming these days, which seems to be more based on Rotten Tomatoes scores than versus artistic merit. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I agree with you, but don't forget that a lot of times these movies, when they came out, everyone sort of relied on newspaper critics and Siskel and Ebert to tell us, if these are good or not.
I know, and 9 times out of 10 they got shit on, but yeah.
Right, exactly. Which is why I love including Siskel and Ebert. I mean, my favorite quote is like, "The Thing, it's the barf bag movie of the summer." It is what it is, but curation is key. It really is important. What I found, I worked at Entertainment Tonight for about 13 years, and I was surrounded by some younger folks than me who I figured were as in tune to pop culture and media and movies as I was, And I realized that a whole younger generation feels overwhelmed with this instant gratification nature of things where it's all available to you. So it's overwhelming. They don't know where to start. And a lot of times they don't know how to begin because they're, if something by this point is such a huge franchise, there's books, there's comic books, there's TV shows, there's animated, there's live action, there's sequels, there's prequels. And something as simple as what I would think would be as simple as Star Wars, where you start with episode 4. Oh, wait, I'm already confused. It wasn't episode 4 when I saw it first, but now they don't know. What do I watch first? So it's a legitimate problem for a lot of these folks. And so they freeze up and they don't start at all. And they get defensive. Oh, I know. I have to see Pulp Fiction. I know. I have to see Star Wars. I don't know where to begin. I'm intimidated. Where do I start with Marvel? Am I supposed to watch, the first Hulk movie by Ang Lee? What do I do? So curation is key. I think these movies, especially by people who are important voices in the industry, when they say I recommend this or I like this, Joe Dante says you got to see Killer Clowns, then you must obey.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, on that note, I think I'm going to go watch Demons after this because I haven't seen that, and your film sold me on it. So I just want to say thank you again for the time, man, and keep doing the good work. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your interest, and I like your deep dive conversations that you have with your guests. And you're doing a sense of curation yourself, so I appreciate it.
Well, thanks, brother, and keep up the good work. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Well, thank you so much, sir. And I
Thank
really
you, man.
appreciate it, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks again, man. And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.